In the summer of 1361, the fields outside Visby turned red. Farmers, blacksmiths, and villagers, ordinary men, stood face to face with the unstoppable Danish war machine. They wore no armor, only courage. What followed became one of the most brutal moments in medieval history, a battle where fate was sealed before the first sword was swung. Visby was not just a fight, it was a warning carved into the earth, a chapter of terror, honor, and sacrifice. Today, we return to that battlefield, to remember those who never stood a chance, yet stood anyway. The summer sun hung low over the island of Gotland, but its warmth could not penetrate the rising fear spreading across the land. It was July of 1361, and the winds that brushed through the golden fields carried whispers of death. Rumors had reached Visby, rumors of an army, ruthless and relentless, marching toward them with iron discipline and the hunger of conquest. Denmark's King Valdemar Atterdag had already taken several farms and villages on his path, leaving behind silence where life once flourished. The people of Visby, farmers, shopkeepers, young apprentices, and old men who had not held a weapon in years, could feel the ground tremble beneath their feet before they ever saw their enemy. And yet, even knowing what approached, they chose to stand, not because they believed they could win, but because some battles demand courage even when courage changes nothing. The morning air was thick, heavy with tension, and the quiet dread that everyone tried desperately to hide. Mothers pulled their children close. Merchants closed their stalls, not knowing if they would ever open them again. And outside the city walls, in the dry summer heat, the people of Gotland gathered one last time, forming a line that history would never forget. They were not soldiers, they were not knights, they were not trained to kill nor prepared to die. They were ordinary men, farmers still smelling of soil, millers dusted with flour, fishermen with hands calloused from years at sea. Some wore nothing but linen shirts, others wrapped belts of leather around their waists and prayed it would be enough. Their weapons were tools, scythes, axes, hammers, objects meant to cultivate life, now repurposed for the desperate act of defending it. Across the field, the Danish army appeared like a shadow stretching across the landscape. Banner after banner rose above armored knights, professional soldiers, and mercenaries hardened by years of war. Their armor glinted in the sun, their helmets shaped like steel faces with no mercy behind them. Horses snorted, pawing at the earth, sensing the bloodshed that would soon follow. Drums beat a slow, confident rhythm, a sound that echoed the certainty of victory. The men of Gotland felt the fear crawl up their spines, but they did not run. For days, they had watched village after village fall, each one crushed beneath the Danish advance. The people of Visby knew the cost of surrender. They knew the cost of defiance, and yet they chose defiance, because the land beneath their feet was more than soil. It was home. It was the inheritance of their fathers and the promise to their children. They would not abandon it. In that moment, as the distance between the two forces shrank, time seemed to stretch thin. Every breath felt like a final one. The Danish horns sounded, deep and monstrous, shaking the hearts of those who heard them. And then, for a moment, there was silence. A silence so complete that the island itself seemed to hold its breath. The first few steps of the Danish advance were steady and smooth, a wall of steel moving with flawless coordination. The Gotlanders tightened their grips, sweat dripped down foreheads, the smell of fear mixed with the dry scent of harvested fields. A young boy, no more than 15, clutched a wooden spear that was almost too heavy for him. Beside him stood an old man in his 70s, his back bent, but his spirit unbroken. 2 generations side by side, united by desperation, and then the battle began. It started with a roar, not from the Danes, but from the defenders. A roar that contained every fear, every hope, every refusal to bow. They ran forward, scythes raised, axes swinging, determination burning in their eyes, but determination alone could not stop steel. The first clash was brutal. Shields shattered, blades tore through flesh, and screams filled the air. The Gotlanders, brave but untrained, fought with the wild strength of men with nothing left to lose. Some managed to land blows, unexpected, fierce strikes that momentarily halted the Danish line. But where one Dane stumbled, three more pressed forward. The field became chaos, dust rose, mixing with sweat and blood. The cries of the wounded echoed across the plain. Still, the Gotlanders refused to fall back. They held their ground, even as the Danish cavalry swept in, trampling the front lines beneath iron hooves. The young boy with the heavy spear was thrown to the ground. A Danish soldier approached him, and for a split second the world slowed. The boy gripped his spear with shaking hands, thrusting it upward with every ounce of strength he had. It found its mark. The Dane fell, but the boy did not have time to celebrate or breathe. Another soldier's blade ended his story as quickly as it had begun. Nearby, the old man fought with a determination that defied his age. His blows were slow but deliberate. His face showed no fear, only a profound sadness, as if he regretted not the dying, but the necessity of killing. When he was finally struck down, he fell quietly, as though closing a chapter he had always known would end on this field. Hour after hour the battle raged. The sun climbed high, shining mercilessly upon the dying and the dead. The heat became unbearable, and the ground grew slick beneath the fighters' feet. Yet the Gotlanders did not break. They fought with a ferocity that surprised even the Danes, but courage cannot deflect arrows. Bravery cannot stop spears, and heart alone cannot defeat cold, disciplined steel. By midday, the outcome was clear. The Danish lines pushed forward relentlessly, carving through the defenders like a wave crushing sand. Bodies piled in the dry grass, shields lay shattered, swords, bent and bloodied, glittered weakly under the sun. And still a small group of survivors tried to regroup, tried to stand, tried to believe that one more push, one more breath might change the tide. But the earth beneath Visby was already writing the final sentence of their story. When the last pockets of resistance fell, the field was silent again. Not the peaceful silence of dawn, but the heavy silence of death. The silence that follows when hope has been buried beneath the soil alongside the men who carried it. On that day, Visby became more than a battle. It became a reminder of what happens when courage meets destiny, a reminder of the brutality of medieval war, a reminder of ordinary men who walked into a storm knowing they could not survive it, and chose to walk anyway. The smoke of the battlefield still lingered in the air as the Danish troops advanced, step by measured step, over the land they had just conquered. But the true weight of war does not fall in the moment of the clash, it falls in the moments after, when the shouting fades and the reality of what has been lost begins to settle into the earth like the blood seeping through the soil. The Danes moved through the field with a mixture of discipline and discomfort. Even seasoned soldiers, hardened by years of campaign, could not ignore the grim sight before them. The Gotlanders, farmers, merchants, boys who had barely reached manhood, lay scattered like fallen leaves after a storm. Their makeshift weapons lay broken at their sides, their simple linen tunics were stained dark, their faces were turned toward the sky, still etched with the terror and determination that had defined their final moments. The Danish officers ordered their men to search the fallen, not out of cruelty, but out of necessity. They needed to confirm whether any still lived and ensure that no one would rise again with a last desperate strike. It was a cold, methodical process, carried out in silence. The men of Gotland had fought bravely, even honorably, but victory demanded certainty, and yet, as the Danes moved deeper into the field, something unexpected began to happen. The battle had ended, but the island itself had begun to mourn. Wind swept across the battlefield with a low, mournful hum. The fields that had once shone with summer wheat now held only bodies and broken tools. Crows circled overhead, drawn by instinct to tragedy, and from the distant hills the people of Visby watched with trembling fear, knowing that what they had just witnessed was only the beginning. Inside the fortified walls of Visby, the city leaders argued. Some insisted they should surrender immediately. Others pushed for resistance. Fear clouded every judgment, and desperation fueled every argument. "Look out there," one elder declared, pointing toward the battlefield beyond the gate. "Those men, those sons of this island, they died because they believed this city was worth protecting. Will we betray their sacrifice by bowing now?" But another responded, his voice trembling, "Their sacrifice is the reason we must surrender. If untrained villagers died in such numbers, what chance do we stand? Think of the children. Think of the families hiding in their homes." Both voices were right. Both voices carried truth, and that was the tragedy of Visby. The battle outside the walls had only led to another conflict inside them. Meanwhile, King Valdemar observed the aftermath with a calm, calculating gaze. He had expected resistance, but he had not expected such ferocity from untrained men. The Gotlanders had fought like a people, defending not just land, but memory, identity, legacy. Valdemar was many things: ambitious, strategic, ruthless when necessary. But he was not blind to bravery. He understood that an enemy willing to die so fiercely was an enemy that must be handled carefully. He ordered his commanders to prepare negotiations. The message was simple: the city must surrender, or it will burn. As the Danish envoys approached the walls, the people of Visby gathered to watch. Mothers clutched their children tightly. Craftsmen stood with their tools still in hand, afraid to put them down, as if the act of setting them aside might somehow invite fate to strike. Priests whispered prayers under their breath, begging for mercy, for protection, for a miracle. But miracles do not always come in times of war. Inside the council hall, the debate grew louder. Some of the wealthier families, traders, landowners, nobles, insisted they could pay whatever ransom the king demanded. They believed that gold, not blood, would decide the future. Others pointed out that the Danes would take the city even if they submitted. "What guarantee do we have," they said, "when a man has the power to crush us? Why would he negotiate?" Outside those walls, the remaining defenders, men who had not been on the battlefield that morning, but had witnessed its outcome, began to prepare themselves. They sharpened weapons, reinforced shields, patched what armor they could find. A second battle, they believed, could begin at any moment. But the city walls of Visby, though tall and strong, held another truth: they were not unbreakable. And the Danes, with their siege engineers and artillery, could tear them down if they wished. The silence from the walls stretched long enough that the Danish officers grew impatient. Their messengers sent another warning: surrender now, or face the full might of Denmark. As the sun began to set, casting long shadows across the field of the fallen, a decision finally emerged, not from bravery, not from fear, but from a deep, aching sorrow. The leaders of Visby agreed to speak with the Danes. When they opened the gates, a hush fell over both armies. The people inside watched as the delegation walked out. The Danes watched with guarded anticipation, and something like respect passed between both sides. For even though the negotiation came in the shadow of defeat, it came with dignity. The spokesperson for Visby, a man old enough to remember the island's last great crisis, stood tall despite the tremor in his hands. He looked King Valdemar directly in the eyes and said, "We ask for mercy." Valdemar studied him quietly. He then declared terms that shocked even his own officers: no burning, no slaughter, no more blood, but the city would pay. They would pay an enormous ransom, larger than anything Gotland had ever surrendered in its history. Gold, silver, furs, weapons, wealth from every household, from the richest noble to the humblest craftsman. The tax would be so devastating, so complete, that it would take years, decades, for Visby to recover. The city leaders bowed their heads. They accepted, because what choice did they truly have? And so, as the night settled over the island, an agreement was made. But while the people of Visby prepared to empty their treasuries, the Danes prepared for another grim task. Thousands of bodies still covered the field. They needed to be buried, but how? The truth would soon become one of the most shocking discoveries in medieval archaeology. The mass graves of Visby, the graves that revealed the brutality of the battle. The wounds, the armor, the stories told by bones. When dawn rose over Visby the next morning, the battlefield was still. No sound of clashing steel, no thunder of charging horses, only the hollow silence of defeat. But the stillness did not mean peace. It meant the beginning of another chapter, one darker and more revealing than any fight could ever be. Thousands of bodies lay untouched across the dry summer fields. Men who had awakened with hope now lay frozen in death, their final expressions captured by the earth itself. Their wounds told the story that words could not. Deep cuts from swords, crushed bones from axes, piercings so clean and precise they could only come from professional soldiers trained in the art of killing. The Danes had won the battle, but even they recoiled at the sight before them. This was not a battlefield. It was a graveyard waiting to be sealed. King Valdemar issued an order: bury them swiftly. The land must not rot. But the task was overwhelming. The number of dead was beyond anything the island had ever known. There were no priests to speak prayers over each soul, no time to dig individual graves, no families allowed to carry away their loved ones. The Danish soldiers and surviving locals had only one option: they dug mass graves. Enormous pits carved into the earth, deep enough to swallow dozens of bodies at a time. The ground shook as shovels bit into it. Men wiped sweat from their brows, and all the while the island seemed to watch in quiet grief. Bodies were carried, sometimes gently, sometimes with exhausted indifference, and lowered into the trenches, layer upon layer, lifeless hands falling over each other, faces pressed into the shoulders of men they had fought beside. Boys placed next to old men who had shared their final stand. Some still wore fragments of armor, some clutched broken tools, scythes, hammers, axes. Others had nothing left at all. But the most haunting part, many still wore their clothes, patched and simple, because the Danes did not strip their armor or garments. In most medieval battles, the fallen were looted. Visby was different, perhaps because there was so little worth taking. Perhaps because the Danes wanted the burial done quickly, or perhaps out of a quiet respect for those who had died bravely, even foolishly. No one recorded the exact reason, but the result was extraordinary. The bodies went into the ground exactly as they had fallen. And so they stayed, for 6 centuries, waiting. Hidden under the soil, the dead preserved the truth of Visby better than any written record ever could. The bones speak centuries later, long after medieval kingdoms had fallen, long after cannons replaced swords, long after Visby became a quiet corner of northern Europe. Archaeologists uncovered the mass graves. What they found stunned the world. Layer upon layer of skeletons, still wearing fragments of their clothing, still bound in the leather armor they had stitched themselves, still carrying weapons that could barely be called weapons at all. Some skulls were sliced clean through, some rib cages crushed inward like broken cages, some legs severed, some arms raised in a final, hopeless attempt to block a blow. Every bone screamed the truth. These men were not soldiers. They were citizens who died trying to defend their home. One grave held dozens of men packed so closely together that their limbs intertwined. In another, the bodies were arranged haphazardly, rushed, desperate. The archaeologists could see where the earth had collapsed as more were piled in. It was not disrespect, it was necessity, but there was one grave that stood out more than all the others, a grave filled not only with men, but with teenagers, boys who had died with their weapons still clutched in their hands, some with armor too big for their growing bodies, others with belts tied around their waists because they had no proper equipment at all. Their bones showed the same wounds as the men, the same fatal strikes, the same brutality, and this was the most heartbreaking truth uncovered. More than half of the Gotlanders died without proper armor. Many fought in only cloth, some shoved wooden boards under their tunics as makeshift chest plates. It was bravery beyond logic, sacrifice beyond reason, a people fighting not for victory, but for identity. The price Visby paid while the mass graves were being filled outside the walls. The city of Visby began paying the heaviest ransom in its history: gold, silver, weapons, furs. Every treasure the city had accumulated over generations. Even church gold, sacred objects not meant to leave holy ground, was gathered and handed over. The wealthy families who had argued earlier now found themselves selling heirlooms, melting heirloom coins, pulling rings off their fingers. They paid because they feared what refusing would bring. They paid because the battlefield had shown them the truth. They paid because they knew Visby no longer had the strength to resist, and King Valdemar accepted every ounce of it. By the time his men finished collecting, the treasure was so large that chroniclers claimed it took days to transport. The wealth of Visby, an island known for its proud merchants, was drained in a single act of survival. But the price did not end with gold. The psychological wound ran deeper. When the people of Visby finally opened their gates after the payment was made, they walked out and saw the battlefield with their own eyes. They saw brothers lying side by side, fathers and sons in the same trenches, faces they recognized buried beneath shovels of dirt. Women collapsed onto the ground, children cried, priests begged for forgiveness from God, from the dead, from history. And in that moment, the people understood the Battle of Visby was not just a military defeat. It was the breaking of a community's spirit, but even in that darkness, something else was born, a story that would outlive kingdoms. A memory preserved beneath the soil, a tragedy that refused to disappear. The bones of Visby became a message written not in ink, but in wounds, a message that still echoes across the centuries when courage meets destiny. The earth remembers. Visby was not just a battle. It was a wound carved into the soul of an island, a moment when ordinary men chose courage over survival, despite knowing the price. Their bones and silence still speak across 600 years. They teach us that true bravery is not victory, but standing firm when hope is gone. Visby endures as a testament to the unbreakable spirit of those who refused to kneel.